Welcome back to Magic in the Noise. Hello, David.
Hello, Sasha.
So what are we going to be talking about today?
Today I wanted to talk about a phenomenon that we have seen in the remote viewing community, and it's kind of interesting. There have been instances in the past where, as an example, I had heard of one group doing their normal remote viewing target, and they got information that was associated with 9/11, and then the next day 9/11 occurred, and they could evaluate their data, and they saw that it synced up with 9/11. So this particular phenomenon that occurs once in a great while with a particular group, where they get diverted from the target that they are trying to focus on, and they get some other set of data, but the data is cohesive across the group. So normally if it was an individual, it would just look like noise, right? But if a group repeats the noise as a unit, then now it looks like something more interesting.
Yes, it's true that group cohesiveness on a target or on a session doesn't necessarily indicate that the off-target data is necessarily more accurate. Daz Smith writes about an experiment on precisely this topic on his website, linked below. And there were multiple groups that worked remote viewing target. The Downing of Flight TWA 800, are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
And the different groups had cohesion within the group, but each group had a different explanation for the cause of the crash. So there was Ed Dames's group, which included Paul Smith as a remote viewer, Farsight Courtney Brown, and the third group was David Morehouse. And each group had a different result for what caused the crash, and with extremely specific details. So despite having high confidence in their data, because everyone in the group had contributed and had gotten similar data, and they had the details, the specificity, they still got different group results. And there hasn't been an explanation for why that is. But how do you feel like that affects the conversation we're having now?
That's fascinating to me, number one. But number two, I'm thinking about how in the absence of feedback, there's no way to validate which group is correct.
Yeah.
So it is interesting that has occurred in the past in that manner. In relationship to this particular phenomenon, there is no target. It's assumed that it's a future target. There's a bunch of assumptions essentially that are cooked into this particular scenario, this phenomenon, that, we've got data that's cohesive, it's in a group, so therefore it must be good. And normally with practice targets, you can clearly see whether that's correct or not, right? So you have feedback because you know what the answer is. And so with normal remote viewing, that works.
Some people often say if a remote viewer has a good track record, then we can trust their data. And I do think that we can trust our data. However, when you don't have any feedback, then it doesn't seem to necessarily be the case that a good viewer will always tell you the truth. The good viewer will collect the data. Whether that data is a belief, a bias is in the tasker's mind, or it's in the cultural mind.
Wasn't there something that Daz did that was proving?
Yes, there was. So Daz experimented. He imagined a UFO landing in his backyard in detail. And then his remote viewers remote viewed not only the UFO landing in his backyard, but they saw extra details. They saw the aliens coming out of the UFO. They saw details about how the UFOs functioned, how they worked, the high-tech advanced technology. That was surprising to me.
Well, I guess it makes sense in some ways, because with normal remote viewing, I have seen basically where you can get accurate data about tangible information that you can validate, right? You can also get conceptual information. You could get information that's not necessarily a tangible. It's more like somebody's idea or dream or whatever. The other thing that you kind of mentioned, I think in there, I thought I heard, speaking about the intent, a situation where a group of viewers get cohesive data, and you've got linkages through that process, usually with a tasker, but sometimes you get monitors, maybe you have two taskers. So it's like you could have the target basically gets kind of skewed in a direction where it's not obvious. And so maybe the data collected is more about that kind of process and less about the future. I mean, obviously it could be about the future. It could be precog. I've seen precog be a real thing. So I'm not discounting that. I'm just kind of intellectually trying to break down the potentials here.
I think there are a lot of points of possible contamination with intent. The intent of the tasker, the intent of the remote viewer, the intent of the monitor if there is one, the intent of the cultural milieu in which they find themselves. And so these are all these points of potential information or data pollution. If you don't have feedback, then how do you parse it out?
Yeah, so if we follow that line of thinking and a viewer draws a single visual with no other details and it looks like a tree, but we know the target is and the target's a tree, then you can pretty much, because you understand the context, you can say, oh, that's good data, right?
Yes. Yes, and that's where the complexity of remote viewing comes into play and why it's so much harder to apply remote viewing to an unknown target. Because you can look at that tree, and we know from our sessions and from seeing other people's sessions, what might look like a tree, basically something bushy at the top, and then there's something extending below it. That could be a mushroom cloud. That could be a geyser. That could be a whole host of different things, right? And when you have the feedback, then you're like, oh, it was a geyser. I thought it was maybe some natural thing, maybe a tree, but it turns out it was natural geyser. And so I think in that sense, it's really important as remote viewers, we've seen this, we know this. And so we know that the context of the data is informed by the feedback. So without the feedback, you have to have other data that can really strengthen the base for the conclusions that you're drawing.
That's a good point, Sasha. So unlike a remote viewing session, a normal one, you would have to have this phenomenon would require a high level of detail far beyond what we would normally do. So just having a visual is not good enough. Even if you had the visual, you would have to have smoke, fire, which still would not narrow it down, because that could be war, it could be an industrial accident, it could be a whole bunch of possibilities, right? Even that is not enough. So it's like you would have to basically narrow down to like Europe. Europe still wouldn't be good because you've got a bunch of wars in Europe. So let's say it was a war, like you're like, oh hey, this is smoke, fire, it's a missile. It's like, well, that's great. There's like a million wars over his, because you might be targeting a past target. You have no idea. It could be the future, could be the past. You don't know.
That's a good point. It could be the past, just because everyone's narrowing in on something, especially at these crucial times of year. You might be pointing to something that people are remembering in that moment.
Yeah, we don't know because it's an unstudied phenomenon. So that wouldn't be good enough, because in Europe they've had a bunch of, like, let's say you've narrowed it down to Europe. Well, that's still not good enough. They had a bunch of wars there. Then you narrow it down to the country, and if it was someplace like Sweden, you'd be like, oh wow, they haven't had a lot of war, and I'm getting advanced tech, and okay, this might be a future event, right? But another country like Afghanistan or London or other places, that still might not be good enough detail. You might have to go have other unique qualifiers, right?
It has to be self-evident, yes, because otherwise your session could be related to a whole host of different upcoming issues, upcoming events, or past ones, imagined ones, movies that are coming out that might portray an incident, anything like that.
This is a good point, and it makes me think of another program that is called the webbot, that is created or was created by Cliff High. And in a way, there's a very similar comparison to it and this particular phenomenon in remote viewing, where you get diverted as a group and it doesn't look like noise, and so you assume that it's something to do in the future. And it's for Cliff. His program, he goes and collects data across the web, essentially, collates it, and it's looking for a psychic contact, but he has no idea what he's looking for. He's literally has to construct out of the data, he has to construct the information. So in the same way, he kind of has no target in his mind as to what he's looking for. He has to let the data explain that to him.
But he does it in a way that it feels more trustworthy. So when you look at what he does differently, what would you see as some of the main points?
Well, what's interesting about the way that he presents his information is he's very specific. like more specific than remote viewing if you look at the comparison of the two. And again, it's a different kind of mechanism than remote viewing, so of course overall it's different, but it's still tapping the psychic part. So he will have Europe, he'll have an economic crisis, he'll have that it's a banking failure, he'll have that it's associated with a credit issue with the banks, and then underneath that, he'll determine that the credit issue is caused by a currency problem. So he'll have a whole string of extreme specifics to drill down at a top level. So he understands exactly where on the planet, he narrows it down, is what I'm trying to say. He doesn't just say there's a bank crisis that impacts the economy. Where? Like globally? Like so he can break down he understands that he can't be ambiguous and he has to break it down into enough detail. And the other thing that he does, which I find very interesting, is that he will always also find a crazy abnormal thing that he's expecting to see in the news, such as one of them I remember being farmers that are fighting aliens. And it's something you'd never expect to see in the news, right? And if he sees that particular news item pop up in any variety, it could be fiction, it could be real, it could be a fake story, like somebody hoaxes it, doesn't matter, right? That will tell him that that string of events that's associated with the credit issue is very close at time. So he has very specific criteria that's very detailed.
So he's actually using these coincident events to pinpoint that this prediction is about to come, or it's related to this, or that's very clever. I see a relationship between how Cliff High does his webbot analysis and our analysis of remote viewing. I think that idea of high specificity, doing the research so that we're not making these leaps and conclusions that aren't soundly supported, trying to find multiple points that support a correlation rather than just one kind of hazy one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Absolutely.
I think that gives the power to our analysis.
I agree. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of wrap up. So to summarize this particular topic discussion, this is something that could occur at any point in the future. We might see this phenomenon from a group of individuals where they get this particular effect, right? And they get the cohesiveness of the data. It has nothing to do with the target, so normally it would be considered noise if you're an individual, but now it's elevated to a different level of focus by people. And the thinking for me is to say, that's great, like we should study this, we should look at it, we should express it. Those people should express that information. It's something that should happen, right? But for the community, I would suggest that they maybe look at some of the things that we talked about and evaluate that data in a way that has a higher level of requirements so that they are not being driven by emotion or fear or anything like that. Because if there's too much ambiguity in the data and it could apply to thousands of potential future events, then in my mind, it's not something that's really worthy of my particular attention and time, other than in the context of let's look at that effect, like let's build a case study on that effect and study it, what actually happens with it, right?
Yes. And I think that our main point is we're wanting to encourage the community not to be afraid, not to panic, but really just to evaluate what is the meaning of this data and how can we better understand it. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
It was way too much.
No, it's good.
All right. I'm just trying to think if I should start over or not. Oh, there is another. Yeah, hold on. Let's start over. Sorry.
We're having so much trouble today. Welcome back to Magic in the Noise. Today, we're going. No.